Everybody, welcome to this webinar, this special panel organization for open source selling solution community. Very excited by this opportunity to talk to some of my friends that I've known for years who have been out there basically doing great work in open source and in building companies and working for companies and creating opportunities for thousands of people, potentially even tens of thousands of people to work in open source. This is a passion of mine. I'm very excited, have been very excited about how do I make a living, how do I build a career, how to make a profession while also participating and contributing to open source. And so we wanted to spend some time today to talk about what we've learned and things we're still learning. So very excited today to welcome Andy and Peter and Wes and Carol to the webinar with me. So I think we'll just get started by, first of all, just asking, introduce yourself a little bit, particularly talk about why did you start to work on open source? And then when did you start to think about how do I make a living out of open source? How did that come in your life? How did that organize itself? I'll give a little intro. I've told my story many times, some have heard it. Briefly, I loved participating in open source as a scientist. I was a scientist, loved participating in scientific papers and conferences and publishing. And my open source contribution felt very similar, like, oh, I'm just sharing results and work and tools for doing science with the world. And I really, really enjoyed it. And I wanted to do that more and more. At the same time, I had small children. I had a family. I had to make a living. And so I'm like, how do I do this? So for me, it's been part of my very basic question of how do I do this thing in the world of participating in open source that I love and serving my family that I love together. And that's been driving me for 20 years, more than 20 years. So that's why I got started in this space. And then maybe we can just go across the top. I mean, Andy, how did it happen for you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, I was similar story. I was in science. I was a PhD candidate writing software for studying fluids and biological fluids at the time. And really the thing that drew me in from like kind of tools that were more closed, like MATLAB was the tool that most people use, Mathematica and MATLAB. But often you would get into the situation where I want to do something different. I want to be able to tinker with this thing because like we're research, we want to make new models and whatnot. So I ported all our code to Python and started building out the simulations and with NumPy and SymPy. And really what it did is give me the ability to actually control the entire story and not just be fed the algorithms that were like stock, if you will. But, you know, I fell into the same trap a lot of people do with Python. I came for the language and fell in love with the community and started giving back. And like there was, just kind of contributing back to things that made my code work and found myself just working more and more with other people. And I just liked it. It was like, it felt really great to actually work with people that had a similar mission, lots of scientists and so forth. Once I got, was no longer a student and went through the postdoc world and realized that like, well, I don't want to have to maybe accommodate the academic lifestyle and have to move anywhere and kind of fight for very small positions everywhere. So I transitioned to industry. And at first it was like working on Python in as a consultant at banks and things like that. And because they have lots of people using the same stuff and they need help understanding things. So that's definitely like the first kind of touch base I had was just like helping other people use the code that I've been working on. And then eventually have been founded several kind of startups along the way since leaving the consultant world. And just kind of same sort of thing, like helping researchers and scientists like build interesting, cool things. And now I'm at NVIDIA doing a similar thing, only inside the CUDA team, helping scientists use Python to leverage the hardware platforms and whatnot. So
that's amazing. Yeah, very, very excellent. And it's very interesting. You're working at a very successful company now that's doing a lot with open source, especially recently. So great to hear from you. And we'll get back to some of those features. Peter, do you want to go and actually do definitely end up what you're doing now was like Andy did. That's a great finish.
Yeah. So how I got started in open source is actually in 1994. I was a Linux nerd, and so you sort of had to also get the open source religion card at the same time.
Was that like when you were 12, Peter?
It was one of the Slackware. No, I was 16, but I mean there was a Slackware it's one of the Slackware disk sets in the README. It's like you also got your little free software card. No, actually, just being part of the Slashdot community, and then on the college campus, being part of that Linux community, sort of got brought into the GNU free software world, and then the origins of the Open Source Institute, all that stuff. So I had all of that. But then as soon as I got into the real world and got a job in software, I sort of like, there was a thing I observed, but I wasn't really part of the community or any kind of really open source community. I was more of a user than a dev. And it wasn't until I started doing consulting in Python, and I loved Python, the language. I was lucky enough to find a job doing consulting with Python, and it was with SciPy and numerical and scientific Python that leveraged some of my scientific background. And that's when I actually fell in love with the community. So it was, I think, similar to what Andy said. The language kind of leads you in, and then we found a community, and all those great people, including, of course, you, Travis, and many of the others that have now created some of these foundational tools. And then it was actually an odd transition. It never, as a consultant, I was quite happy. And it didn't occur to me to ask a bigger question of sustainable open source, or how do we make even more money? It was more just when we were doing all this consulting, we're starting to get into big businesses. And I realized, it wasn't just using SciPy to solve interesting problems, but it was actually, holy crap, big business computing and IT and everything is so incredibly ineffective and inefficient. These open source tools can absolutely disrupt this. And all these open source people are so great. And I love that community. Holy crap. How do we embolden and empower and motivate that community to go after this? How can we just really just knock it out of the park? So it was all through this disruption. And at some point, I think I realized, hey, maybe we can make a lot of money doing this too, and let's go for it. But it wasn't, I didn't ever really connect that to sustainability until, much more through, a few years into actually running Anaconda, right? When we were like, okay, this is a real problem as people adopt this, and maintainers are burning out, maintainers like Wes and others. Like, it was like, this is an issue. And then I caught the economics nerd bug as well. And I know you've got that as well, Travis, a little bit. So then figuring out, how do we do crowdsource, digital commons, regenerative economics? How do all these things, how can you take gift economics of open source and marry that to the marketplaces and capitalism and all these things? And I've been nerding out on that for like the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, I've been, moving from CTO to CEO and now to Chief AI Officer at Anaconda. And even now at this moment in time, big questions for me, I just got back from an AI Alliance meeting in San Francisco. Big question for me is, how do we actually create digital AI commons? How do we make sure that we can lock innovation open, create the infrastructure to create open standards, and allow many future generations of people to actually consume these technologies as a public good, and not have them be locked up in walled gardens forever in perpetuity? So that's what I'm doing now.
That's awesome, Peter. And I know a lot about that for the first 6 years, and then it's the past 6 years. We stay in touch, but I don't get a chance to see you as much as I'd like.
Same.
So really appreciate you joining here. Great. Carol, really appreciate you being here. Love to hear your story a little bit.
Yeah, I think my story is probably unique in this panel. I actually didn't start open source until kind of halfway through my career. When I was at MIT studying applied economics as well as electrical engineering, I had all this free stuff available to me. And then when I went and worked in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley version 1.0, he worked for national account sales for AT&T, and then worked as doing product management and product marketing for one of the first and eventually largest voicemail companies. So rode that trajectory up with them. And then life took us, and my husband wanted to go back to school. So we moved across country, and I was a director of engineering for a 2,000 person company that made, at the time, uninterruptible power supplies, but they were trying to network it with systems to shut down gracefully. So really, that was the first part. And then I took a really long break, and it was right around 1995. And I was chuckling at Peter's Linux thing because my daughter was born in 1995, and I'd been doing all this Unix, Linux, Windows NT, I think at the time, work and networking. And what I did in my free time, as a new mother, because all new mothers would, is I networked like 6 different computers in my home using Linux.
awesome.
And at that time, there was no graphical installer. It was, so my experience with open source was as a consumer of open source. And then phase 2 is I got really involved with open hardware, because all of a sudden, from an electrical engineering standpoint, you had things like Arduino come on board, and you didn't have to pay for the development kits. And so did a lot of outreach work in San Diego for Fab Lab San Diego as a geek in residence, and sort of going back to my MIT days with that. And we're teaching wearable electronics and how to build things, and to a variety of people. At the same time, I was dabbling with Python and was doing like a lot of workshops and community workshops, and stumbled upon this thing called Wakari, which Travis and Peter and probably all of you know well, but it was a listed version of what was then IPython notebooks, I believe. And we taught some of the first community workshops using Wakari, because I could see the accelerator and the multiplier effect it had on people's learning, which is really what rocks my world. And so phase 3 was joining the Jupyter project, riding the wave there of that and Python. And then most recently, I was VP of engineering for a seed and Series A startup that eventually got acquired. And now I'm getting back to my technical roots, playing with NLP, doing angel investing, and just playing with toys.
Amazing. So a lot of experience managing engineering and doing engineering at the core, and then seeing the value of open source for education, for growing knowledge. Right. That's a very awesome story. And Wes, thank you for your patience. But a lot of people know your story. Of course, you're very, very prominent library contributor and company starter, and now budding VC, which is exciting. And we'll get to some of that, I think, hopefully in the rest of the call. But love to hear, summarize what you can about your story and as it relates to this question.
Yeah, I'll give the cliff notes. So I'm Wes McKinney. I got interested in using open source for doing financial analytics in my first job about 16 years ago, and started building what would turn into the Python Pandas library. And at that time, there really wasn't a toolkit for doing data analysis and statistics in Python. And so that led me on a journey to get in touch with the Python community, start getting involved in open source development. So open sourced that project at the end of 2009, and wrote my book Python for Data Analysis, and started working with some of these folks to try to make Python a mainstream language for data science, which it has happened as a result of like many important work streams happening in parallel over the last 12 or 13 years. And so I went on to start building businesses, because I realized that entrepreneurship needed to go hand in hand with building these software projects, that it wasn't enough just to build open source software, that we also needed to create business models that could have a virtuous cycle, like a beneficial relationship with the underlying open source projects. So I founded a company in 2013 called DataPad with kind of early Pandas contributor Chang Shi, and we went on to work at Cloudera, and I got involved in the big data community there, and helped create the Apache Arrow project, which has helped kind of create a unified data interchange and computing layer for data science tools and big data systems. And that's kind of snowballed into a bunch of other things. But more recently, we founded a company, Voltron Data, to in part to do enterprise support for Arrow, but also to commercialize GPU accelerated analytics starting with NVIDIA hardware based on Arrow. And more recently, after spending several years working on Voltron Data, I went back to work with Posit, which helped me incubate Voltron Data, and working with them on their Python strategy, continuing to do open source development, And as Travis mentioned, I've been dabbling with angel investing the last several years, in particular investing in companies that are building or building with some relationship to the Arrow ecosystem, or some of these new open source projects which are making accelerating computing, making the stack more composable, interoperable. And so I saw an opportunity to collect some capital to make more investments into the space, and to help other founders build businesses and create companies that could help further drive forward the open source stack.
It's amazing. I mean, so actually, thank you for sharing all these stories, some of which I knew, but some of which I did not. I really appreciate learning the details. This is an amazing group. I think looking across the breadth of the way people make a living using open source, we've got company creation, we've got VC investment, we've got working in a large company, we've got helping steer communities towards standardization. The amount of innovation unlocked. I think that's one of the key things open source allows, is kind of an untethered and an unguided, it's emergent capability set. And what impresses me, and Wes, you hit it on it. Part of what made Python dominant in data science is the breadth of independent work streams, the amount of people that came together and actually did multiple things. Sometimes that creates chaos and challenges because, oh, this doesn't work with that. But in another way, it makes all kinds of opportunity for businesses and for independent activities to thrive. I'd kind of like to follow up with kind of a question about, so along the way, what are some of the best ideas for earning a living as an open source contributor you have seen? And I realized, for me, for example, I would have a hard time saying the best, because I think it's a fabric. There's lots of ways. But if you're an open source contributor, who wants to still keep participating in open source, but also wants to make a living, have a career, what advice do you give somebody, or what are the patterns that have worked? I've been experimenting in this space for a long time, and when I wrote NumPy, I had a big question about it. I had a lab I was trying to run, had students I was trying to graduate. I was trying to apply for grants. So I actually started creating a book, and I sold the book, right? I wrote a book and sold the book with the intent of having the proceeds from the book. You buy the book. Thank you, Wes. Yeah. And that was interesting. It's certainly my first foray into a business concept. I ended up selling 30,000 copies, right? So it made $90,000. I did it self-published, and effectively that money went to fund, it funded a summer for me, and then it funded 2 years of a graduate student that was doing a PhD. So that was my first example of, okay, if I do something and actually charge for something, then maybe I can direct those funds to something productive. That graduate student ended up contributing some of the iterative linear algebra libraries in SciPy. So I could see a direct correlation between business activity and open source progress. That's one of the first things as an academic that got me excited about this. So it led to, okay, one way is you can charge for an artifact that comes out of open source, right? And that was reasonable. That seemed to work okay. I'm not sure it was just the productization of open source certainly was a way, and there's lots to discover about that. So maybe just go around, maybe we go in reverse. Wes, what are some of the ways you've seen that good ideas for earning a living as an open source contributor? Like what advice would you give somebody who has that desire?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few common patterns. Like one is probably the most common one you see is consulting, where you find users of a project that you're working on, and they pay you to either add features or customize the software to their needs, or maybe you work on integrating and working on the actual application of the library in their systems. And one of the challenges with that is it sometimes can lead you to spend less time working on the open source project that your goal was to support in the first place.
Yes.
I think the ideal would be maybe like a 50-50 split, but often, you end up as basically doing development work for the company that you're consulting for. And, the amount of time you're able to spend on the open source project shrinks down to, 10% or less, which is not ideal. Sometimes, the more startup route is you build a product that is based in some part on the open source project. That does pose similar risks. Sometimes you can become beholden to venture investors, and that can sway your priorities and also lead you to spend less time on the project. than you would like. Increasingly in recent years, you've also seen a lot of direct sponsorship through GitHub sponsors. There have been a number of developers who've been able to make a living through GitHub sponsors, and there's things like Open Collective and Tidelift, which provide kind of other like ways to funnel particularly funds for maintenance and like unglamorous work into projects. So Travis and others created a nonprofit, NumFocus, to provide like the legal financial apparatus to make it easier for corporations and individuals to put direct funding into projects.
Andy, you were president of NumFocus for several years,
yes.
right? You were very significant in growing that.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Wes.
So yeah, there's a lot of different things, but yeah, it's a challenge, and I think what I've seen is that always the problem is how to not get pulled away from like the focus on the underlying technology, and it's obviously you're not going to be able to spend 100% of your time doing just doing open source development on GitHub, but you would hope for something approaching like 50-50.
Yeah, that's a very great summary. Go ahead.
Jump in like on like the consulting thing. I think I've been very successful in my career doing consulting, but I mean now, like, I don't know, 15 years ago, it was kind of like, you're just trying to figure it out. Now I think like partnering with folks like Open Teams to actually make those contracts. So that, like, yes, I'm going to be working on the open source part, and you can build into your contract, especially if you have a partner who's good at doing that. Because like to get the larger contracts with larger companies, you have to have a partner anyways. And so I would like even shout out there, like if you're going to go to that consulting route, you can build in like actual pieces of your contract to come back to the open source part. And that's something you can partner with folks like Open Teams with.
I appreciate that shout out. And certainly Open Teams is trying to create patterns. I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do is create patterns and let people replicate those patterns. It's about, and definitely it drives us at Open Teams to figure out how do we get rid of some of the cruft that makes it hard, and then just enable, you do end up having to focus on the customer. And Wes, you said it well, like at some point when you're, and it's really true for anything you're trying to use to monetize open source, you gotta sell something. And either you're selling somebody paying for development of open source, which is happening now in large companies. It is happening at Quantize Labs. We have a thing called the community work order, where we specifically tell people, okay, here, you're going to pay this money and you can talk about the features you want, but you're not going to guarantee those features. You're just simply sponsoring the open source community and sponsoring developers in this space. But at some point, I think you've got to tie some, contractually, or, Peter, you did the Anaconda dividend, some sense of, hey, we're going to actually drive revenue from this activity to open source. And that's intentionally built in. One of the things we've done at Quantize Initiate, which is my foray into venture investing, and I can go into more detail about why I did that. It's like very premature probably for me to be trying to be a venture investor, but I wanted to do it because of a particular big, hairy, audacious goal of making open source monetizable making open source investable, creating a market for open source. And I've talked to folks about this before. I've since learned that I actually don't need that venture fund to do that. But it was initially, I was like, I gotta have to have a check in hand to get people to do this thing that I want them to do, which is tie some of their revenue or equity to the open source community. Because at the end of the day, it feels like that is what makes this work, is when people do that, when companies do that. NVIDIA's investing heavily in open source by hiring people. Now, it's an open question is how much time and people end up spending on open source versus just the company issues. Peter at Anaconda, we did a lot of this, and Anaconda is still doing this, funding people, significant budgets, funding people to work on open source, right? And you can go into more detail about what's happening now. I know that happened. I knew the budgets. I knew we were spending a lot of money on open source, and that's paying people to work on it. Wes, you've done that too. Like your companies have spent a lot of money on open source directly. But somebody has to be intentional about it. And Carol, you've seen it, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the key thing is while you're growing an open source project, and I'll go back to somebody who maybe started a project and is maintaining it, maybe has a handful of contributors. There are definitely success stories out there. Fast API, by focusing on documentation and ease of use, they've come up with a very strong product or project, if you will. And then, it seems reasonable that they will productize it down the line. but also, other things like MK Doc's Material Insiders theme has, blanking on the guy's name, but he's built up a very strong GitHub sponsors workflow and things that to fund new features that eventually do get rolled back into the unpaid version of the theme, which is great. But I think, I think a lot of it comes back to yourself as an individual and being very self-aware, because running a business is very different than being a really good, technical contributor. And, it's either, if you have those leadership skills, communication skills, selling skills, great. But if you don't, then I think the key is really to surround yourselves with people that do have that experience, but who don't want to pull you away from the direction of the project. And, we talked a little bit about VCs, and I think, Wes, very smart, angel investing in sort of Arrow related companies, because it's still bolstering your project. But I think there's a lot of different ways to do it.
There's a couple of things you said there that are really powerful, I think, Carol. One is, make sure your project's really good. If you're a contributor to an open source, want to make a living, like making it usable. So making sure people can use it well will just grow the user base, and then lots of opportunities arise from just that fact, right? That's one important point I heard that sounds like it's really good. And the other thing I think that was really interesting was surrounding yourself with complementary capabilities, like making sure you're work with people that can do the stuff you don't do it all,
right?
And find the people to do that. That's really
good. I think
good.
Wes alluded to it. Time is your greatest resource, and automating the heck out of your project where you can. Leaning into best practices, using good other open source tools, really setting up a solid project from the start, because that is what draws people who are users in. There's a reason people used Arrow and Pandas and NumPy and all the rest. So yeah, I think
that's really well said. So in all the different ways to make a living, don't forget, you got to make the project really good.
Yeah,
because that'll, and in fact, I definitely would attest that I've seen that too. Fast API is a good example. Polars is emerging as an interesting example. But basically, you get something that people just start using, and then you get users. And Wes has tons of examples of this as well. Peter, what are your thoughts? I mean, this has also been true, Anaconda, and I know a lot about how we've done things together, but also you've been doing a lot of things on your own for a while. How do you see this?
I think, and I've been typing some of the notes here as people have been talking. I think there's, the way I frame this is that, it's not just a matter of monetization. I think it's with open source, it's really hard in general to tie. We can always see the commercial monetizable value of the work that's been done. But I think if you go down the route of monetizing the artifacts directly, it puts you directly in opposition with some of the dynamics which created the user community and created popularity of the projects. And of course, we run into some of that as we did change our terms of service so that large companies that are hitting, the hundreds or thousands of users, we charge them a modest amount to get the updates and everything and use our commercial secured repository. But that still, it always feels a bit like, well, I thought this stuff was free, right? Well, it's like, yeah, it is free, but at the same time, our CDN costs are not free either, right? So there's, and all the devs that like actually do the grinding package builds, they're not free. So you just start having this conversation where you're already anchored on I get free stuff to then non-free. And that's a very big quantum jump, right? But really, I think the question of monetization maybe is better framed in this way, which is that I think there's many different kinds of stakeholders and many kinds of communities that emerge around projects as they first are created and as they mature. And so the question for a maintainer, the question for the developers is how many communities do you have? How many can you actually sustain? And are you equipped to do that, right? Because you initially have a developer community that in the maker community, they care about vision and technical merit and things like this. And a lot of what Carol's been saying and others really, I think, are ways that can create greater cohesion and build a flywheel of growth around those values. But then the instant you bring in users that you then want to monetize, then you should look at them as buyers who aren't paying you yet. And a buyer user community is very different than a user community that's simply a latent or potential contributor community, right? And those are very different. They both look like free users, but they're very different. And Wes, to some extent, I remember an amazing conversation we had back in like 2018 or something, Wes, I think it was, when you're like, man, I got people showing up GitHub now who are just like, this thing sucks. I don't even like this. I have to use this for my job. Fix your stupid code, right? Maybe it's not quite that colorful, but it was something. It was some. That was the gist of it. It might have been worse. It's of course now rampant. Right now, it's a completely rampant to the point of being a vulnerability that is exploited, multi-year human exploited vulnerability by possibly state-level actors, as we saw with the XZ exploit. I think that, not to get too dramatic, I think it's like a 9/11 for the open source development communities in general, that state-level actors are going to actually attack the fact that you are a human being trying to do this out of love and out of passion. They will exploit that, and they're going to jam you and jam your community and use it as a way to inject things into your code. Unbelievable, right? So we have got to figure this out in the next couple of years, or this kind of community, this kind of modality will go extinct. I think there's just no possible way for it to be sustainable like this.
Yeah, we're having this conversation on the back of that. I mean, people may not. Can somebody summarize quickly the LibXZ issue that arose? Andy, have you looked at that?
No, I'm learning it here.
Peter, maybe you want to summarize.
Wes, do you want to give
do you have a
run through?
Yeah, I was following it. I was following it pretty closely. Like, it just happened last weekend, and it was definitely like disturbing my sleep, and having a lot of anxieties and fears about it. But basically, like an open source actor showed up in a kind of a relatively unmaintained, or like turns out to be an important part of the Linux supply chain that's depended on by some, basically ultimately SSHD, which is how people get access to remote computer systems. But they found like a part of the supply chain that was not very maintained, where there was a possibility of introducing backdoors. And basically over a period of multiple years, like this quote unquote contributor did a lot of labor in the project and built up trust, and more or less was able to introduce these highly obfuscated vulnerabilities into the project. And then there was a network of sock puppet accounts that were created to put pressure on different Linux distributions and maintainers to pull in like these great new changes that were released in the XZ and the lib LZMA library. And the only reason that the vulnerability was found was that as a result of a kind of a something that they did wrong, or that like kind of an imperfection in the exploit, that they made SSH logins a little bit slower. And so there was a curious developer who was like, why are these SSH logins slowed down like a lot slower than they should be? And that led to kind of spelunking and finding the exploit in the backdoor. But it had that not been found, I mean, this could have gotten out into major Linux distributions, and ultimately, it could have become like a widespread exploit that could have lived in the wild for a long period of time. And I saw somebody joking on Twitter. It's like, thank God we found like the one backdoor in the Linux supply chain. I think the reality is that like the scary thing is like, what other types of things like this that exist now that have not been found, or that have been done in the past, and we just don't know about because they weren't discovered or they weren't disclosed. And I think it's kind of supply chain attacks in open source are really terrifying. And so it occurred to me that state level actors, like, because clearly like it must have been state sponsored like Black Hat kind of hacking essentially, But it's a huge risk, and
it's hacking of the community, right? Hacking
yeah,
of
this
the,
certainly,
Right.
yeah,
It's
because it
the
was
sale actor sustaining
it was
effort running
it was
inside
not
the
just
OODA
a
loop of
yeah.
any of these open source communities.
Yeah, so
Right.
it was not just it was not just a technical exploit, it was also a social
Right.
exploit, because
Yes.
it played
Right.
on kind of like the, everyone was so eager to have, kind of contributors, take over maintenance in these projects that have so few maintainers.
Right.
Right.
And I think
And Wes, you and I know both
things-
understand this. Both understand the desire to have other maintainers come in and help, and the will, and how that can happen. Right. Go ahead, Carol.
No, I was going to say, about, I don't know, 6-8 years ago, like economics of cybersecurity became sort of a new research field. And this is really some of the learnings from that research really enforce that it isn't going to be just an individual thing. In fact, you could use exploits as I hate to say it, like monetizing a product where maybe you're using AI to create all those sock puppets or contributors, and you're willing to invest, skeleton contributors for, but
Right.
there's definitely, like, it's not a zero-sum game. There's definitely a multiplier effect once they see it work, and then, okay, what else is out there that we haven't found? And that is, I think, what keeps me up at night.
Do you think it'll why people are contributing to open source might start being asked? Like if this was a state-sponsored actor, for example, we typically don't ask that question when people are contributing to open source. Like, what's the motivation? I'm curious if that will be a stronger question. Like, what's going to be response to this?
Why?
No, they would agreed. I think they could.
What's that going to get you?
Yeah,
they'll tell you they're really, really passionate about floating point precision inside SciPy. That's why. I don't know.
But knowing, okay, wait, who you're working for. I know in the past we've had some concern about, let's call it, corporate capture of open source. This is a common issue. One of the issues is, as you start mixing money with a project, and Peter, you mentioned this too, like, what impact does that have? Like, because all of a sudden there are some people being paid. And I've thought about this with Quantsite Labs. I mean, I'm very excited. We've actually got a group of people who we're actually paying to work on projects I care about. And that's been one of the most exciting things for me over the past several months or several years. But on the flip side, we've had to address that question. Wait a minute, some people are being paid, some aren't.
So
what does that mean? How does that affect the community?
So
Andy?
I guess just to jump in a little bit here, like, how's this going to affect some of this? Like, CPython and the PSF has recently hired a whole security team, right?
Right.
And if your project wants to be a part of the corporate infrastructure, security is super important. And like, you can pay, like, and this is kind of the economics of it a little bit. Like, hey, I want to be able to run, I don't know, NumPy in a secure environment. Well, yeah, a researcher is not going to pay for that secure environment, but a corporation will, and they'll pay probably 10x what a researcher would pay for. And so understand that economics of, like, why people make money and what service you can give. And to be frank, you charge 10x for the service that the corporation can make a lot of money off of, and then that can fund the rest of your project. But I think
it sounds like an opportunity.
But I've literally been on conversations, with people with billion-dollar IT budgets who say, well, if we pay for these improvements, are you going to, if they just go right back into the open source, then our competitors benefit? There's literally I've been literally those words.
Sure. And right? I think that's part
and that wasn't even security, right? It's not a great conversation because there's no way past that conversation, because they come from a culture, and the corporate culture of sense making is ultimately tied to, it's a kind of a zero-sum math around some of the stuff. This stuff is not viewed as, there's not really a great contemplation, I think, in the procurement and CFO office about what were the rich human ecology and the various things that led to us getting all this manna from heaven.
But corporations are multi-hydra as well. They're multi-headed, and therefore there are other people in organizations that are like, wait, how do we get some social good? How do we show that we're good people? I agree with you, Peter. You hear that conversation, then you can go to often the same company, just a different department, and they're okay. We've got budget because we're trying to promote our open source giving image. So how do we do that? So I see kind of schizophrenic behavior from
and I
multiple
think this is
companies.
actually, I think this is a really, really cool way, which is the maybe the monetization. Well, I've put all sorts of crazy ideas forth on this topic, as all of you know. But the idea of naming and shaming a little bit, or the idea of actually asking the dev community and senior tech people and tech fellows who are part of the technical stakeholders in the user community, who understand the quality of a bunch of nerds nerding out and taking the time to ship things when they're ready, and the value of open standards there. Having those kinds of folks push strongly within their organizations, actually make it part of their almost their job description to get to the next level. You want to be staff, you want to go to principal. Part of what you're doing is advocating for the improvement of the industry. And part of that is that you're helping to move these open source projects and give them visibility through like an open source program office or through whatever within your company, right? And that's kind of part of your charter. And I think if we were more explicit as maintainer communities or as sort of, community shepherds and whatnot about that as a possibility, then you actually, I think there are dots that can be connected. And you're absolutely right, Travis. I don't mean to be so doom and gloom, but it's just really shocking to be literally, as someone who is so like positive sum in his approach to the world, to really be right there with this knife in your face about, yes, but if we make it free, then all my competitors can use it too. And it's like,
so Peter, we've had all these discussions over the years. And I think, from my vantage point, having lived in a proprietary only world and done business in that, innovation took a lot longer. And now with open source, innovation's much quicker. I mean, just look at like how much faster we are accelerating new things, for better or for worse. But I think the key with that, oh, well, my competitors are going to get it. Yes, but you will have a jump on your competitors because you're already building it into your business, and you're basically the first mover. But I think, it's sort of like you said, everybody gains by making it open source. And if you're trying to build a moat and a trench around your business, you're only going to capture the people that are in that within your little moat.
Yeah. The other argument I think is that's right, but if you keep it, you're maintaining it. Do you really want your precious, resources to maintain your edge to be used there, to be used on maintaining this edge, right?
Well, that was actually the conversation I used like 11 years ago with a certain hedge fund CTO when I was trying to convince them about using pandas and like moving to this, and he was, I don't know if you were at that dinner or not, Travis, but it was in like Stanford, Connecticut or something. And,
I remember the conversation. I don't think I was there, but I remember the conversation.
It was just incredible. And he was just like, why should I use this open source stuff and why should I contribute back to it? I'm like, well, in about 18 months, every new hire you bring in is going to know how to use that API and not your crummy internal jacked up NumPy record array thing you've got, right?
But this is a subtle argument, but people are starting to recognize it. They're realizing, oh, we're right. I've got massive technical debt because I didn't open source this, or because I didn't focus my energy around my actual value prop to the world. Instead, getting distracted by all these other little fixes that are important to me, but not critical to me.
Coming back, you just want to frame it. You need to frame it with whoever you're talking with. If you come in and you say, "Hey, we're going to innovate." Like, look at Snapchat and Nadia Iqbal's study, like showing that like $75 million in innovation came for free out of the open source world. That's powerful to like corporate folks. If you're going to somebody who's I don't know, maybe a large hardware vendor, coming and showing like, "Hey, we've got all these users that we're going to empower with this open source technology." So if you as an open source maintainer want to have some power in that conversation, build a user community. Because like if you come, the NumPy has 40 million users. If you come and say, I have 40 million users that you can get in front of and help use your systems, they're going to be excited about that. And so like, I'm not excited about like dieting, but there are people in this world who are, right? And so it's the same with businesses. Find out what their value chain is. Is it, MGM on Washington Post today, there's an expose on them losing $100 million because they didn't patch some of their Linux stuff, right? Like that, that you're talking to corporate IT, like, hey, do you want to lose $100 million like MGM at a very public event? Or do you want to actually support the software that you are running your business on? And so I think that that's really
well said.
Those dots with whoever your audience is.
And making sure that we actually adapt it. Like
Well, and
adaptive.
businesses
There's a
are,
lot of answers.
they
Go
have
ahead, Peter,
learned,
sorry.
they have, I mean, it's useful to, I mean, it costs somebody $100 million to be to be in the corner with a dunce cap, I guess, and some of the stuff. But people have learned now. And to your point, Trav, as well, like people have been seeing now the value they get from these kinds of things. And the conversations now that we can have in 2024 are different than the ones that we were having in 2011 or even 2015. And so I think maybe if I may actually ask a question of what actually now changes now that there's an immensely fast growing area of great promise and potential, which is generative AI, just AI in general, that undoubtedly sits on an incredibly complex stack of open source software. And now that people have 10, 15, 20 years of learnings about the value of open source and open standards to accelerating innovation, is it possible to actually unbreak this or unstick the collective action problem, the prisoner's dilemma of why should I invest if someone else is going to invest and I get the benefits for free anyway, right? What are the kinds of things that we see that's different about the conversation moving forward that we couldn't have done 10 years ago? I mean, do people have thoughts on that at all?
That's a great question. Let's just open it up. Who has a
I
thought?
have a related question to that one, and specifically for Wes. I've been really impressed over the years of how you've had multiple successful open source projects that have been successful as projects and sort of been authentic. Like you don't look at the project and say, oh, that's some corporate BS that, is. How did you balance all of that and sort of make it an authentic project, but also an income producing project?
I don't know about the income producing part is a complicated story. I guess I'll start with the building like the culture and the communities around the projects. Like I think that having a really strong narrative about why the project exists, like what are the values of the project, like why you're doing what you're doing, I think has been really important. And then trying to recruit other maintainers and contributors into the project that share your values and share some of your common motivations. And I think that I've been lucky to be able to attract those people into Pandas and into Arrow, like basically like the true believers, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and so that comes through the conference talks that you give and their blog posts, and just basically how you conduct yourself in the project and on GitHub, and maintaining like that kind of culture of openness where people can feel included in the project, that it doesn't feel like this exclusive community that's hard to break into. It's like everything is happening in the open. As many discussions as possible about how the project is making decisions are happening in the open, and so it feels like something that people can jump into and start to make an impact. How you connect a successful open source project with getting corporations to open their pocketbooks. I wouldn't say. I think that like writing a successful book about pandas definitely helped with definitely generated a good amount of revenue, and kind of mainly because Python became a popular data science language, and people buy the book in part to learn how to use pandas, and it's become like a popular reference textbook for college classes and things like that. That's not very repeatable. I think writing a successful book about an open source project is pretty difficult. And as a way to support yourself would be pretty challenging to do again and again. I think with Arrow, there was kind of a sense at the time that that kind of building a collective solution or a shared solution to that problem of like accelerating interoperability or like improving composability, modularity in these systems, like was something that was emerging in like the mid to late 2010s as something that a lot of people started to care about, just because they were seeing it happen in their internal systems. And so I think there was kind of just it was good timing that there was a lot of people interested in that problem, and that I offered them like a place where they could put their money where their mouth is and put real dollars behind the development, and that there would be a benefit to giving money to me to invest and to direct, as opposed to just providing funding in the form of like development in kind, having developers internally contribute their time, which they also did and is also extremely valuable. And so like probably the most funding that corporations provide to open source is letting their employees contribute. And that's kind of, it's hard to measure the investment there, but that reflects, probably the lion's share of open source contributions these days.
Yeah. This is excellent. Now we're running up against time. Peter, I love that question you asked about generative AI and the impact on open source. I might ask to invite you back and have a conversation about that specifically, I think on another event, because I think that's a very important question. I had it written down as something I wanted to talk about too. This has been so great though, just to hear from everybody. I think we'll just give everybody 30 seconds, a minute to just wrap up and say something you want a point you want to make or what you learned, and then we'll finish. So maybe Andy, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think overall it's been great to be here, and I appreciate the invite. And I think corporations are investing into open source projects, and you can work with corporations. You have to learn how corporations work in order to work with them, and realize, just like Travis said, they're collections of people, and so understanding the motivations and how the dynamics work there is super important. But I also think it is definitely gaining steam, and most corporations realize they have to work with open source world, because that's where the users are and that's where the innovation's happening. So keep up the good work.
Peter.
So I think for me the enduring someone said time is the best resource. I think Carol, maybe was that your quote earlier? And I actually think that in addition to that, though, that the network reach of open source is absolutely huge. And it's this incredibly differentiated ability for open source communities to reach into the long tail, into niches, and solve problems really well. And so then touching on something that you and Wes just talked about, right? The innovator-led project, community-led projects, there's values and integrity to those values at the core of that, which is what really differentiates, I think, the spirit of technical innovation and the technical arts that all of us here on this particular conversation care about. Open source is almost too open of a term. And it's now so many people are astroturfing and sort of open washing stuff that does not have that ethos. And so I think that as we think about this question, it is so really important to think about the innovator. Oftentimes it's one or a very small group of folks and their values and how to help them hold those values in the community around it in integrity, while then also adding and holding for these other stakeholders, whether they're corporate users, financial VC investors, whatever it is. You can, I think, make all this work, but not if you muddle it all together and just like put in a blender. It has to be really, I think, very thoughtful as an interaction between communities with completely different, actually, dimensionalities of values. And it's a hard job. It's a really hard thing.
Excellent, but worth it.
Worth it.
Great comment.
It's
Carol.
Definitely worth it. Like, as you said, time, really critical, like probably your most valuable resource, because everything else you can kind of throw money at and increase. You can't really increase your hours in the day. The other is change is a constant. And I think successful open source folks, I know when Min and I started with Jupyter Hub and we built it, and then Binder flew out of it. It was all of the small, like, oh, let's try this. Can that work? Oh, maybe not. Okay. And it's that learning and sort of being able to, at the end of the day, have that fun, experimentation and learning on really how you innovate. Like, you can't just say, okay, we're going to do this tomorrow and that be innovation. It never works that way. It sounds nice, maybe in a soundbite, but it doesn't really work that way. You've got to build it. And I think, keeping in mind, change, your time, and looking always for a multiplier effect. How does a network, a network of humans, accelerate adoption, move my project forward? Wes alluded to it with good conference talks, things like that. But, time and change, it's going to be a dance you're going to do while you ride the wave. But I think open source, the results speak for themselves. The innovation is there.
Fantastic. Wes, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's never been a better time to get paid to work on open source projects, and so I think corporations in general are friendlier than ever to hiring people or allowing their employees to work on open source. A lot of the big tech companies like Microsoft have become super open source friendly in recent years, and that's had a big effect kind of on normalizing open source in the corporate world. But it's still tricky, and it's not straightforward for a lot of people, and requires some persistence and creativity. And so, I'm hopeful that 5 or 10 years from now that that things will be even better than they are now, and that some of the funding models or support models that will be more straightforward for people to jump into a project and start getting some financial support for their contributions. Not quite there yet, clearly, but we've made a lot of progress.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Now we're going to have some time for some questions. I would just end my section by saying you're not alone. If you're interested in making a career out of open source, it's absolutely a fantastic time to do that. You're right, from corporations hiring you to people who you can relate to there's funders out there who understand open source companies. There are innovation approaches being taken for how to connect money from companies back to the open source community all over the place. So I would recommend reach out to anybody on this panel. Very approachable. Everybody on this panel is very approachable. Reach out. You're not alone, and you can absolutely make a difference if you're trying to figure out, how do I make this great thing I've done even better and connect to my living, to my career. So I really appreciate everybody being here. I do believe there's some time for some questions, so we'll open it up to questions now. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a really rich conversation in the chat, and a lot of really great questions that have been asked. Unfortunately, we only have 15 minutes, so and we've got over 15 questions. So unless we do a speed round, we're not going to get to all of them. As much as I would love to do Peter's generative AI thing, I think that's a whole nother event in and of itself. But let's start with one of the questions is, and it comes up a lot, how significant are the legal considerations when monetizing open source software, particularly in terms of licensing and intellectual properties?
Yeah, super important, I think. I mean, just to jump in here, like if you have to sit down and think of your strategy of where you want your library to be, and I always come from an adoption perspective. Like typically, if I want the maximum adoption, I'm going to look for the most permissive license. And then there's a continuum of like, well, I want to include things that perhaps are coming from maybe the private or closed source world, and what licenses are compatible with that. And there are some, but you can kind of create several different projects. I mean, the common open core is like a business model that really pioneers like how do you structure all these things. But it's it really is critical to make sure that everybody can distribute your code. They know whether they can modify it, or they can run it, where they can run it, what they can run it on, and like that world has become a little bit more complicated in the last few years. But it's, if you don't, you need to stop and think about it in your strategy of like monetizing anything you do.
Peter, Travis, any other thoughts? If not, I'll move on to the next question. Okay. In your experience, what is the most overlooked revenue model in the open source ecosystem, and why do you think it's underutilized? And maybe I'll put Peter on the spot for this one.
I think the most overlooked one, honestly, is actually I don't know what to call it the most overlooked. There's a bunch of different things that are not just selling products, right? That people can build consulting and services based and teaching and training based things around open source things, at least in the early stages. But if the projects are they get really big and successful, then actually the creators of the projects no longer have monopoly on that information, right? And so their differentiated knowledge, which may have been quite rare to start with, it becomes more commoditized. And so that expertise, as the project gets more successful, that expertise becomes more commoditized. And certainly you don't get the kind of scale that would be attractive to getting investment, which you can then put back into the thing and build a product. So that's why I think a lot of people do overlook that or sort of denigrate that. But I think that one of the things that we'll see here, especially in AI world, is that we have already too much software, and that a lot of the things that need to connect the software to the use cases are where a lot of great work can be done, and open collaborations and technical innovation can be done there. And they may not look like products, and they may look like little very sort of niche software as a service or AI service powered services, and that's okay. And like I think it's maybe it takes some people like me or whatever to say more often, it's fine to build a business that does this kind of thing and doesn't scale to $1 billion. Like that's great if you're helping solve problems and you like what you're doing and you're part of a very valuable ecosystem and you're maintaining stuff that everyone needs. That's awesome. So I think maybe it's not so much unexplored business cases as much as just validation that it's valid to do that, right?
Right. I mean, I've often talked about pipeline
I
translating.
love that, Peter. I totally agree.
Yeah, because like when you've got a workflow, you're doing lots of handoffs, and the handoffs are where things inevitably go wrong. So if you have an expertise in the handoff and can translate that into both the business side of things as well as the technical side, you could carve out a nice niche.
In the terms, especially if you ever start looking at government grants, government grants is another one that I think is underlooked and not talked about a lot. And they're not that hard to get. I mean, they're competitive, but they're not as competitive as people think they are, because often it's very hard to find people. But if you just look for that term of integrator, right? So especially so at Anaconda, when we first started out, we had DARPA grants, and one of the big pieces was they needed integrators. And all that really meant was taking the open source code and applying it to people's workflows in the DARPA ecosystem. And so like that integration pipeline is something that the federal government spends a lot of money doing every year.
Great. So from a product perspective, are there new models to build a product that is open source, but also monetize the product? Traditional models are with a support model like Red Hat, but was wondering if there's any new or emerging alternatives.
Well, one thing I thought about it, again, to keep bringing back to LLMs, you can imagine actually producing some kind of weird thing where it's like you produce the library and you have the documentation, you sort of do what you do. But if you want an expertly fine-tuned thing that can code gen around that library, then that's what you charge for. And so you charge to plug that into your code generator. And then maybe the developer holds back a lot of their own internal test cases and use cases. And maybe they can say, well, that's not so collaborative, right? Why don't you give it all away? But then, maybe they don't want to. And so but you could sort of do that kind of thing where it's like, I'm giving you the live, it's like free car, but the maps you got to go and pay for in the back, right? Yeah. Especially if you want your self-driving robotaxis to use that, then the GPS navigation modules are in the back and you got to pay for those. This is like a variant of Travis's, sell the book, give away the code kind of thing. Anyway, that was one
performance tuning, like performance. I mean, just the same thing with model tuning, performance tuning your product to the goals of whatever organization you're working with. And the other, I think maybe it is what traditional Red Hat did. I don't exactly know what Red Hat did, but I mean, adding corporate features like SSO in order into your like if you have some sort of service or whatnot. Like there's a set of features that corporations need for security, like we talked about a little bit, and just kind of listing those out and kind of making those things the thing you sell is a model that I've seen work quite well at this point.
Yeah. And I think, I like a lot of what Peter just said too, because having managed a Kubernetes SaaS project with 20 something engineers and, all the different services, Datadog, whatever, there's a lot of complexity that's built into it. And to have an LLM like, thing that helps people get up the learning curve faster could be a really, really powerful add-on to that companies would pay for. It's sort of like, training, by chat or something. I don't know. So another question was about innovation, and has anybody
Hey,
seen any
Carol,
hard?
I don't know if my audio is coming through very well.
It's coming through not at well. What's up, Travis?
There's some road noise.
I apologize. Thank you for it's road noise. Real quick, I think customers want solutions that solve their problem. Open
Right.
source is great at building infrastructure and components and capabilities. There's a ton of products to sell in that difference.
Right. So the specialization to meet the user need, I think, is what Travis is saying. There's lots of business opportunities there, and I would definitely agree. And thinking about innovation, has anybody seen any hard evidence on open source and innovation? And has anybody seen people measure it?
I mean, Nadia Egbal was like did her whole study. So like
Right.
in I think it was Roads to Bridges. I don't know. I forgot the name of it.
Yeah, it's not
But it was
Bridges,
for the Ford
Roads,
Institute.
something.
But then there's also recently. So I guess when we talk about innovation and you're talking about like a macroeconomic level, like I don't know any other study at that level. There's definitely studies and or at least reports out of like science and scientific impact of those things. Um, I know Thomas Wolfe had one. He presented on a whole bunch at the last Pi Data Amsterdam, where they came in and showed like how the LLM and the transformer models are impacting a number of very high profile projects throughout governments throughout the world and some of their innovation stuff. But yeah, I don't have like the World Bank report on it.
Great. I'm not sure how we are on time, Tyler.
We have time for probably one more question and then a wrap up.
Okay. So I think maybe a question that's sort of on the forefront of many of our minds with this generative AI kind of being such a big driver in our ecosystem for the better part of the last year. How do we think that's going to impact open source businesses and the ability to monetize things?
Good question. What do you think, Carol?
I think, to me, having seen several different waves of paradigm shifts in the market, first cell phone service, then the web, it's going to have an impact. What it's going to be, I don't know that I can say now. I think what will be useful is with open source, you can try lots of different options, and then sort of the ones that are successful will percolate up. And I think that is how we're going to get those innovative services or projects. But
Yeah, and I think there is a fear, and maybe we should just I can kind of I can't give answers, but I can talk about a little bit about like some of the things going on in my mind. Like there's definitely a fear right now that things are gonna like balkanize again, and you're gonna have just your
mhm,
PyTorch and just your Jacks, and the companies will have their models on top of that. And I love this report that or this snippet that Lorena shared in the chat,
mhm,
going back to why Meta is pursuing the open source route as opposed to what I see LLMs constantly do is like closing up. But the reason a lot of these LLMs are closing up is because, well, there's a lot of questions about their data, right? Like we have a lot of litigation right now with ChatGPT on where was that data trained and the lineage of that data. And so these are hard questions that open source folks, I think, have kind of not don't want to like really dive into without a lot of investment. And I see that especially. So I mean, I run the infrastructure council for No Focus right now. And as soon as like someone's like, oh, we're going to do some more AI stuff, we're like, whoa, let's talk about what we're going to do, because we're not going to do the thing where we just go out and steal everybody's data and make a model that predicts everything. And so I think we as open source leaders need to come and show the world how to innovate in a public way, and show and give like that respects people, respects privacy, respects all the ethics around it. And I think that we have a lot more learnings from the last 20 years of doing this in the software world. I mean, when I got started, it used to be like, breathalyzers were a big deal because you couldn't review the code, and there was a lot of evidence of errors. And now, like, I think that many places, like, you have to be able to share the code to be inspected by experts on that sort of software. And so I think we're in that same moment, right, where the closed hardware moment turned into more of the open hardware moment. And so how it'll affect the future is still wide open, but I do think it's definitely a debate that's going on right now, and we need to be active in it.
So, Peter, what do you think would be useful as we wrap up for folks to look at in the next year in terms of monetizing open source?
Well, I think I've said this before, and so maybe now is definitely the time to say it again. I think we are coming to sort of the twilight of the era where software by itself becomes the primary value driver, the primary driver of alpha in the capitalism game. And whatever we want to do, whatever our values are, whatever we like to do as a community, we exist within the broader game of the world. And the grand game of the world is now looking at these merged, fused code plus data information systems.
Mm-hmm.
And and so we come from one particular island, but there's this other whole giant thing there, which, to Andy's point, we have to consider that and have our point of view and have our ethos and fight for those kinds of things we care about, but know that we are one small army with one set of spears in a giant landscape. And it's really great that companies like Meta are open sourcing tools like PyTorch. What they're not open sourcing is all of the Facebook's users' history of interactions and engagements, though, right? They're not open sourcing those things. That's not being given out. And so, yes, the cars are free. The oil definitely isn't. And so now what are we doing, right? So I think when we do think about this, we come back and look at, okay, this magical thing that happened that produced all this innovation, however we may measure it or however we don't have it measured. I think it's undeniable that the open source community has created a tremendous amount of innovation. And we may have challenges directly monetizing that as a software community because frankly, it commoditizes a lot of the innovation, right? But all that being said, there were certain wonderful values out of the human ecology there. Great communities, great people. I got to meet people like you guys, right? And so there's something magical there about that human collaboration that, by golly, it would be great if that continued forward somehow. Now that we have a worked example of it working in the software world, can we make it work in an AI world where the code and the data come together into these new cybernetic systems? Actually, I guess that's just information systems. When we put the control loop and the actuators and sensors out there, then it becomes a cybernetic system. It's really, really important that we actually be torchbearers for this stuff, because a lot of people in the data world, that is closed and has been closed since the beginning of time, and people guard that stuff with beyond a zero-sum mentality. It's completely, absolutely locked down. Right? Those people are not going to come out with a community of sharing. You don't see like the big medical data providers saying, let's share all of our data. No. So if we actually want to fight for certain kinds of generative values in humanity and saying, look, innovation forward means actually more open collaboration, security means transparency, all these different kinds of things, right? Different aspects of why we care about the open and open source. We may end up having to be actually the torchbearers because ain't nobody else going to do it. So I don't know if that answers the question on monetization, but just kind of building the bridge to the future bit. I think there's lots of opportunities there for commercialization, monetization, because if you're adding value at the end of the day, you should be able to make money off of it. That's quite moral and quite right. But it might not be directly monetizing the open source code anymore, right? I think the world may be moving beyond that point.
Well, and I think you've summed up a lot of things really well, and it's the impact on the world beyond the software itself. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for attending, for being here. Hopefully we'll do another one of these because there was a lot of interest and many more questions. I don't know if Travis is accessible to say a few words. But thank you, Open Teams, for hosting us. And
I'm here. Sorry for the connection. Really
Yeah.
appreciate y'all. This is amazing. I was hoping the connection would be a little stronger, but really appreciate this. You all are I think, Peter, you said it best. Like, just the fact to be able to meet people like you is why open source is awesome. And that is replicated a million times over in the human condition, and it's good. It's a social good. It makes the world a better place fundamentally. And yes, there are ways to make our livings. Maybe it's not selling the software, but there's solutions and things to build and do and services to provide, and it's all available. And I'm very excited for the future, but it's going to take intentionality. It's not just going to happen. So really appreciate you all for being here. Thank you, Carol, for
Thanks for
hosting
having
the
me.
question
This
and
was
answer
great.
session.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks
take
everyone for
care. Have a
attending.
great day. Bye.